now. Hi, folks. We're just giving everyone a few seconds to get logged in here before we get started. If you are already logged in, you can open up your chat window, and there's some information in there about how you can buy Kyle's book and how you can get 15% off with a special coupon code. So find that coupon in the chat. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to host tonight's event with Kyle McCarthy, launching her new book, Everyone Knows How Much I Love You. She'll be talking with Leslie Jamison, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. Greenlight storefronts are currently closed, but our community is still here, and we're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, I just have a couple of housekeeping things. First, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. Your video and audio are not turned on. They can see your name over in our attendee list, and they'll see your name when you comment in chat or when you ask questions in the Q&A. There are a couple of Zoom functions we'll be using throughout the event that you'll see if you scroll over the bottom of your Zoom window. One of them is an icon labeled chat. You can post comments in here throughout the event. You can, say hello to the authors, provide some virtual applause after the reading or during high points in the conversation, and just chat with the authors and to your fellow attendees about what's happening in the discussion. There's also an icon at the bottom of your Zoom window labeled Q&A. This is where we'll be pulling questions from during the audience Q&A portion towards the end of our event. You can type your questions into that window at any point throughout tonight's conversation. And if you see someone else's question that you would really like to hear answered, you can go ahead and upvote it. And the questions with the most likes will float towards the top of our queue as we're pulling questions to ask Kyle. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our website and social channels later on. And tonight's featured book, Everyone Knows How Much I Love You, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com. Though our stores are closed, we're working with our supplier warehouse for fast direct-to-home shipping. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. And we're offering 15% off the featured book when you purchase it from Greenlight's website in the next week. Find that coupon code in the chat. Our interviewer for this evening is Leslie Jamison. She's the author of 3 nonfiction books, The Recovering, The Empathy Exams, and most recently, the essay collection, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, as well as a novel, The Gin Closet. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and directs the graduate nonfiction program at Columbia University. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Kyle McCarthy. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. Her fiction has appeared in the Best American Short Stories, American Short Fiction, and the Harvard Review. And she's received support and grants from the Edward F. Albee Foundation, the Lighthouse Works, and the Elizabeth George Foundation. Her new book, Everyone Knows How Much I Love You, is a uniquely dark entry into the canon of psychologically rich novels of friendship, compulsive behavior, and the dangerous reverberations of our actions, both large and small. Kyle is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Leslie and with all of you. Kyle, please take it away.
Thanks, Chelsea. I just want to start by saying thank you to everyone who has tuned in. It's sad not to be in person, but it's so wonderful to feel all the support from so many friends and family members who I know are logged in. And I also want to say thank you to Greenlight for hosting. A special thank you to my editor, Sarah, and my agent, PJ, who have just been a dream to work with through this process. So thank you so much all for being here and the way nowadays that we are all here. I am going to start by reading from the book just a brief scene. As Chelsea said, my book is about a dark friendship between two women. They were friends in high school. They become estranged for 12 years, and then they reunite in New York City and eventually become roommates. And Rose, the narrator of the novel, is writing a book about her best friend, Lacie, although Lacie doesn't know it. So this scene comes early in the book, and it's a scene I wanted to share in part because it was one of the scenes that helped me understand that Rose was going to break boundaries over the course of the narrative. So here we go. One day, pretending to myself that I was curious about Joy Williams, that I wanted to read the collection Lacie had carted off to bed last night, I found myself rifling through Lacie's underwear drawer again. This had been happening to me more. Having broken the seal on her bedroom, I kept going back. I liked looking at her things. I liked touching them. They helped me feel her. They helped me get her on the page. In those minutes in her room, I somehow felt closer to her than all the nights we spent talking. Now, I fished out the red Victoria's Secret push-up and pulled at the tag. We wore the same size. It was nice to see it declared there in a plain gray font. Careful not to think too much about it, I pulled off my flannel top, unhooked my Macy's bra, and then threaded my arms through her straps, latched and straightened, looked in the mirror. The contraption pulled and hoisted, creating from my bony rib cage a valley of flesh. Was this what men liked? I touched the cups, twisting my body like an odalisque. It was all so cheesy. But maybe I reached into the closet, back to where Lacie kept the peach dress, and slipped it on, steadied myself. Yes, in her bra I scanned her dresser, snagged a tube of color, put her lipstick on my lips. I looked even more like her. I felt even more like her. Shifting my weight, cocking my head, raising first one shoulder and then the other, I tried to imagine how it would feel to wear these clothes in public, to snag second glances wherever I went. Behind me in the mirror, I could see her bed, all crumpled sheets and creased paperbacks, capped pens and shrugged off sweaters and socks, the pillow crumpled up against the wall. In a flounce, I threw myself down. Inhaling deeply through my nose, I took in the sour smell of her sleep, the tang of sweat, and something deeper, almost vaginal. On the pillow was a single dark hair. Beside it, a notebook, opened. I started flipping pages. I knew it was bad. As a writer, I particularly knew it was bad, but I couldn't help myself. The book was already opened. This was what I found. A note to pick up cheesecloth, the phone number of someone named Sandy, the date and time of the next JFreg meeting, a diagram for what looked like a chrysalis, a sketch of a woman asleep on a couch. The woman was me. For a long time I stared. My mouth was a slack hole, unrecognizable, but it was definitely me. She had even filled in the blonde hair with a colored pencil. At the bottom, there was the date, 9/13, and the time, 10:37 p.m. I remembered that night. She had stayed up late working on her loom, and I, lulled by the rhythmic clacking, had let my book slip from my hands and a deep sleep suck me down. As I had been sinking, some bright thread of conscious thought flashed. This is real friendship. To fall asleep in the same room, to let my guard down so completely. I was home. I slept. And then she had taken a pen and recorded everything ugly about my face. The doorbell rang. I swore. Lacie wasn't likely to waltz home in the middle of the day, but what if she had? What if she had forgotten her keys? I went to the door with my arms crossed against my chest, braced. It was the UPS guy. Lucinda Salt, he asked, holding out a big brown box. More yarn, no doubt. Yep. With a stylus, I signed a big L and S. Thank you so much, I purred. You're welcome, he gushed, taking in my short dress, my cleavage, my glossy red lips. Then he winked. I was grinning as I shut the door. Her clothes were a kind of magic. With them, ordinary words, an ordinary moment flushed pink. Later, though, I felt disgusted and ashamed, bloated, as if I had gorged myself on candy. Lolling on the couch, back in my boring blue jeans, I vowed to stop. Thank you.
Kyle, it's so wonderful to hear you read, and such a pleasure and an honor. Really lovely in every sense to be talking to you about the book tonight. In a way, we've been talking about this book for many years. I was lucky to read it very early on. So I consider myself one of the people who's loved it the longest. And I think actually I'm so glad that you read the part that you did, because I loved what you said about how it sort of introduces Rose as somebody who is starting to break boundaries, has already broken boundaries, that one of the ways you can think about the book is the sort of breaking of more and more boundaries. And also, even in that passage, we see so many of the complexities of friendship that are present in the book, and that idea of true friendship as like letting your guard down, but also true friendship as like seeing some of what's ugly or difficult about another person. And I thought, I mean, the book is about so many things, like what it means to be young, what it means to be a maker, what it means to be a woman, what it means to have complicated feelings as part of intimacy. But it is, among those things, a book about friendship. And I thought maybe we could start there. And I guess I'm hoping maybe you could tell us, as a kind of introduction to the book, tell us a little bit about this core friendship between Rose and Lacie, and maybe what some of the complexities were at the core of that friendship for you, and what you wanted that friendship to illuminate about women, about intimacy, about ambivalence. Maybe I thought we could start there.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. It is such a joy to be talking with you. Leslie was, I think, actually the very first person to read a draft of this book. So she's right when she says we've been talking for years and years about it. And it's funny, I think that often when we think about dark friendship or dark female friendship, there's this sort of idea that it points to something that's troubling or wrong about friendship between women, that it includes an element of jealousy. And I think certainly in the scene that I read, you see that Rose is sort of curious about what it would be like to step into Lacie's clothes, quite literally and also figuratively. But I think that beyond that jealousy, I think the darker elements of friendship really point to what is so primal and deep about friendship, that it's not a sort of addition on to family and romantic partnership, but that it is actually a deep way in which we figure out who we are, and the process of mirroring your friend and seeing what you admire or sort of envy in her can be a way of figuring out who you are. It's actually quite profound. So as the things play out sort of explosively between Rose and Lacie, but I don't think of it as a book that's about what's wrong about friendship between women, but actually just about what is so rich and fertile and deep and complicated.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly that idea that a friendship can be so many things at once, just like a human being is always so many things at once, or just like any intimacy is many things at once, that like a dark friendship, its notes of darkness don't also push everything else out of view or out of existence. That sort of deep well of intimacy that maybe is there in that moment of drawing her on the couch, or even in seeing her and her flawedness, even if it can feel like a kind of violence, that sort of site. And I think the structure of the novel is such that we get a couple of different perspectives on Rose and Lacie's friendship, because they're living together as 30-year-olds in Ditmas Park. But the novel sort of toggles back and forth between that adult plot line and their adolescence when they were, or really their childhood and then adolescence when they were first becoming friends. And I'm curious, it seems like one of the obsessions or one of the revelations of this book is about adolescence and like everything that's so like fierce and difficult and formative and like deeply vital and alive about adolescence, and maybe particularly for women, like everything that kind of shapes us about that time. And you get at it through their young plot line, but also in the present tense, Rose is a tutor who's working with a young woman named Isabel, which hopefully we can talk more about as well. But I'm curious sort of what you were curious about, or what you were discovering about adolescence as you were writing this book, or what you were interested in sort of showing about adolescence and the ways it kind of haunts us.
Yeah, I think I was very curious in the way that adolescence haunts us. I mean, I think we all know people who they say something sort of offhand, and you realize that their self-conception totally doesn't match who they are today. They're sort of calling back to the ghost of the teenager that they were. And I think that can work both ways, right? Many of us sort of carry inside of us the sort of sense of the wallflower, or the kind of shy or uncool kid who was perpetually overlooked. And that, I think we carry that self into our adult lives, even when it's really no longer relevant. And I think part of what was so fascinating to me about Rose is that I think actually carrying that sort of injured self forward causes a great deal of destruction to the people around her. That it's not a sort of inward, oh, low self-esteem is sad. It's that low self-esteem can actually really hurt those who you want to get close to. So that capacity for outward destruction when you carry your adolescent self into your adult life, something I spent a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's such a great way of putting it, just on a human level as well. Like, I'm imagining like 100 people all sitting at their computer screens, like nodding or saying the like internal or external amen. It's just that way that we carry our younger selves, and maybe particularly our younger wounded selves, like almost like multiple versions of ourselves, like little Russian nesting dolls inside of us, or something seems so right and so true. And such an exciting thing about form, right? Or the form of the novel, that you can kind of play God with structure and actually move back and forth between multiple eras in their history to really kind of get at the grain of how that haunting plays out. And as you said, how that sort of like inner damage becomes an externally damaging force. There's a moment that I think speaks to exactly what you're saying, where Rose is remembering the cruelty of junior high school girls. I also remember the cruelty of junior high school girls. But where she says they smelled what was eager on me, they scorned it. And so in a sense, it's not just like the wounded self that's getting carried around, but like all of the like terrible junior high school girls that are getting sort of carried around inside. But I was so interested in that line, like the idea of eagerness, and that it could be something that was smelled on you. And thinking about how this novel seems really interested in desire, and both what's so powerful and catalyzing about desire and female desire, sexual desire, but a lot of different kinds of complicated desire that maybe don't have easy names like sexual desire. But the sort of motivating force of desire, and then also like the shame of desire, how it has both of those sides. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what role desire plays in this book, or what role sort of that kind of attendant shame, how that attaches to desire in this book.
Yeah. It's funny. I Rose as a narrator first came to me as like giant desire, like giant sort of I just heard this monologuing voice, and she was angry and she was pissed off and she just wanted stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think that has something to do with reading a lot of Thomas Bernhard and Jeff Dyer, and somehow translating that into 21st century New York womanhood or something. But I think it was also maybe a reaction against this feeling, which I think one can see in one's friends, but also maybe in like many literary heroines or protagonists that in sort of recent novels, where there's sort of a stance of coolness or deadness, or the response to the contradictions of womanhood is a kind of detachment. Mm-hmm. And a estrangement from what one wants. And that makes a kind of sense to me. And at the same time, almost every woman I know knows a lot about what she wants and is actively pursuing it. And I wanted to give voice to that other side of being alive, because I wasn't seeing it in a lot of contemporary novels that I was reading.
Yeah, well, and I think, okay, I have so many questions that I want to ask, and so many questions that I want to ask actually directly off of what you just said. And I would also say I have a ton of questions that I'm going to keep asking questions, but I would also just encourage everybody who's there who has a question to, I see some people have already started, but go ahead and type some questions into that Q&A function, because sometimes people are shy at first, and then there are a ton of questions flooded at the end. So I would encourage you guys to start putting them in there, and we'll turn to them soon. I might have to speak to a small child for one moment, but I'll ask this next question before that, which is related to desire, and maybe frustrated desire, but also really related to what you were saying earlier about the ways that Rose's inner wounds sort of become an externally damaging force. And one of the forms that takes is Rose's anger. I mean, I was really interested when you said that Rose arrived as a kind of bundle of desires, and she was kind of pissed off when she arrived too, because one of the things that's most kind of compelling about Rose as a character is her anger and her relationship to her anger and where she follows her anger. So I would love to just hear you talk a little bit about the experience of writing anger, sort of like what role you think anger plays in this book, and the kind of ways that it shows up, how it played out, what it's like even on the level of like prose or scenes to manifest anger in the pages of this novel.
Yeah, I think, well, as I said, I do feel like one of the sources for Rose's voice was first Jeff Dyer and then Thomas Bernhard, who are both writers who sort of, they love the complaint. And I think and actually I should say, I was thinking about this lineage, and then I was also realizing as a teenager, I read Jamaica Kincaid's essay, A Small Place, which is also an essay that's brimming with anger. And I think what unites these three writers is an interest in repetition. And for me, anger often feels like it's about repetition. And I find repeating phrases in prose can be kind of intoxicating. It's probably why I need an editor to tell me to pare it back sometimes. So I think that's one way that I think about anger, is this sort of circular repetition, that it needs to be balanced, at least on the page, with humor and lightness. And I think that's part of what was delightful about writing the Isabel scenes, the scenes of sort of tutoring on the Upper East Side in New York City, because Rose is angry about the contradictions and hypocrisies of that world, but she's also sort of, I like to think she's a little funny about it. It's sort of funny to notice the contradictions. So And just to sort of broaden a little bit deeper, I think when we think about political change, anger and humor and repeating ourselves, and also a little bit of humor is often a very powerful way to get our message across. So
yeah, and I love certainly, so much of this is a very funny book. I think it's funny in a lot of ways, and I think it's funny on a lot of levels. And I think, as you say, that humor, it's not only a counterpoint to some of what's also sort of dark or unnerving in the book, but feels, as it does in life, I think, authentically baked into everything unnerving. That we don't sort of get life separated into the portions of food on the toddler plate, or sometimes I do, but emotionally there's a lot more intertwining. And I think the role of humor in this book sort of does justice to that intertwining. And certainly there is a lot of humor, but also kind of unexpected moments of profundity or tenderness around some of the tutoring material with Isabel. And I think certainly you use the word contradiction a couple of times, like certainly a wonderful sort of wisdom and richness in the ways that this novel sort of holds contradiction in relation to Isabel. And one of the kind of through lines of the Isabel plotline is that Isabel's working on her college application essay, and it ends up becoming an essay about feminism. And I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit. Isabel's essay, where it starts, where it goes. Earlier we were talking about the ways that a kind of disaffected affect can be one female response to all the contradictions of kind of shame, desire, aggression, passivity, all these like mixed social messages. But I would love to hear you talk about sort of like what role you see Isabel playing in this book, and particularly maybe how Isabel and Isabel's essay is a way for this book to think about feminism, and kind of what this interest book in feminism is.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of interested in feminism, and it's also interested in what it was like to come of age in the 90s, as you and I did, and what it was like to come of age in the 2010s, as Isabel does. So, and part of the way I was interested in that is I think that there are sort of slightly different brands of feminism that are in operation. I think the feminism that I grew up with was maybe sort of a little bit complacent, but also the rules for kind of presenting yourself were maybe a little bit more relaxed, more influenced by grunge. And I also worked as a tutor, and when I started tutoring, I was struck by how put together the women were, and how the teenage girls were, and how sleek they were, and yet how versed they were in many kind of tenets of pop feminism, or a kind of sort of girl power feminism. And I think that sort of talking about adolescence in the 90s, being an adult in 2016, 2015, and then being a teenage girl in 2015, and kind of stacking those three different experiences of womanhood side by side was one way to think about all the different ways that we occupy these female bodies.
Sorry. I feel there's something that feels sort of horrific about muting the sounds of female, young 2-year-old female desire in the background as we discuss all of its richness. But I think one of the to me most kind of compelling and moving parts of this book psychologically is the ways in which it honors the kind of, not only as we've been talking about, the kind of muddled quality of feeling, and the ways that sort of maybe loathing shows up where we're not expecting it, but like deep love can also show up where we're not quite expecting it. And that certainly the way that Rose feels about Isabel There's a lot of kind of, there are ways in which she mocks Isabel or feels a kind of, at times a kind of pity, at times a kind of loathing for Isabel. But there are also these moments of tenderness that they kind of speak to that, the way you were describing those three layers, that as much as Isabel might be kind of set up as this other, she's not totally another, and her reckoning is not unrelated to Rose's reckoning with femininity or what it means to be a woman or what it means to be sort of structured by male desire, and also really angry at the structuring force of male desire, and those sort of unexpected moments of resonance or complicated kinship are a really beautiful sort of depth revelation of what you could maybe think in the beginning, oh, I know how I'm going to position in relation to this like absurd Upper East Side tutoring gig, but you actually don't know your footing to it. Rose doesn't totally know her footing, as it turns out, and we don't either as readers. There's a moment that's connected, and in a few minutes we'll turn to some questions from the audience, and feel free to add more questions. I see that they're starting to pile up, which is wonderful. I think there's a moment when Rose goes home and she's talking to her parents, and she's talking about her tutoring job, and says, she says some version of like, I hate the kids. And her mother, who's a therapist, and one senses through her presence in these pages, like very psychologically wise and acute, says, well, don't you mean you hate all the gross forces of capitalism and sort of systemic income inequality that like make, and privilege that make these teenagers what they are? And Rose says like, no, I hate them. And it's this kind of amazing moment, because the novel says, Rose knew that what she was saying wasn't quite right, but she wanted to say it anyway. And it says that she was sort of claiming harsh land in that moment by speaking in that way. And I wondered, I love that phrase and I love that idea. It seems so true. Sometimes we say things that we don't mean. A lot of times we say things we don't mean. But I'm curious whether that idea of like claiming harsh land resonated for you across the novel more broadly, as a way of thinking about, say, Rose's character as this kind of destructive force, or some of the moments of kind of malice or cruelty that show up, whether what that idea of harshness, and maybe harshness as an alternative to like being good or something, how that kind of echoes through this book for you.
Yeah. Earlier we were talking about how maybe the voice of the parents is sort of the voice of literary psychological realism that is sort of always interested in describing life like two sides and kind of depicting people as they usually act. And it is interesting what you can convey when you use more dramatic brushstrokes. And I'm not going to trumpet one over the other, but I think for me, part of what was liberating about this book was thinking about tendencies or feelings that I have sensed in myself, that I've heard other people talk about, that I've noticed in others, and just pushing on it and pushing on it. And even the process of living with Rose was a process of kind of discovering what she would do, what she would push through. And it is just the power of a bold gesture. It's the power of a big, broad brush stroke across a white canvas. Mm-hmm. And it's not a way I've ever written before, and I found that it was really fun. I think it's the fun of being unreasonable, which I think returns us to the question of anger.
Yeah. Well, and I would just say, from a readerly perspective, I think that the thrill of the dramatic brushstroke against the white canvas, and the kind of the psychological thrill and kind of the genre thrill of feeling like this novel knows a certain set of rules and conventions and has actually said, no, I'm going to like turn up the volume on those, or like maybe just toss them aside entirely, like it's really thrilling to read as well. And it creates this sense of sort of destabilization and the sense of surprise. There's that, and I think actually the thing you read is a kind of a wonderful moment of seeing Rose sort of turning away from being good or doing the reasonable thing. And of course, it's so much more interesting for readers to get to follow Rose into Lacie's room and follow her trying on Lacie's bra than she sort of imagined doing those things or analyzed what it would mean that she wanted to do those things. Like we were just like, yeah, put on the bra, you know, like that's that much more interesting. And I think that I'll ask you this question, then we'll turn to some questions from others because there are a number of them. But this one sort of emerges really naturally from the passage that you read, and it's a quote that I love from. Sorry, I'm just looking for it. Yeah, when at one point Rose goes to the Met and she's sitting in front of the Temple of Dender, which, as many of you might know, was kind of shipped to Manhattan block by block in order to be saved from a flood. And Rose thinks, funny how stealing and salvaging can look the same. How you can call one by the other's name. And I guess in relation to that moment in the Met and the scene that you read from, I'm wondering how you see this book as interested in the idea of kind of theft and maybe the connection between theft and intimacy, or that sort of like porous boundary between two people and what it might mean to like steal from another person. But particularly that moment, that relationship between stealing and salvaging, how thinking about stealing and salvaging lets us get at something about intimacy or being close to another person.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the moral charge that we associate with those two words, and then to try to think about how often they both apply to the same action. So the first thing that like most obviously comes to mind is writing. I think all the time in contemporary discourse, we're trying to figure out what constitutes stealing, whose experience is available to write about. And yet I also know that for myself, and I think for many writers, writing is this act of trying to salvage, to try to hold on to experience, remember something. I mean, I think the primal action of keeping a journal is often just like trying to remember. And if you hear someone's story at a bus stop, you want to write it down so you remember it. And I think that this question, as it shows up in writing, actually really shows up in friendship and love and human relationships. We can want to be so close to someone that we imagine our way into their experience. It's a way of understanding what they're going through. It's a way of trying to maybe salvage what they feel. And it can also feel very invasive. I think we've all had, Rose sort of wants to be in Lacie's life. It's an attempt to sort of steal from her life, but it's also a way of saying, I like it so much that I want to hold on to it. And we're often so eager to sort of decide if something is one or the other. And I think it's interesting how often they are both. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how uncomfortable it is to live with that bothness, to face it. And the novel does so much of that kind of facing and reckoning. All right, I'm gonna take us to some questions from all the people. There's so many people here, which is so exciting to see, and a number of questions already. And the first one is, I believe perhaps from your editor. But the question is, how was the editing experience for you? What was that experience like?
It's from my editor. I say, wonderful, amazing. No, it really was. I think it's funny. I think that because I was so sort of keen on Rose's voice, I can't believe I'm about to use this phrase, but I'm going to do it. The first few drafts came to me in a fever dream, which I think writers often describe writing as a fever dream, but they came to
everything is a fever dream.
yeah. I once joked that I wanted to be in the Fever Dream book club. We just read books called The Fever Dream. So I think the editing process was a lot about sort of clarifying my intention, and my editor, Sarah Weiss, helping me become more clear about who Rose is and who Lacie is. And often the process was about both kind of leaning into the bigness of action, as we were talking about, and sort of that broad gesture. And also, I mean, I feel so lucky that I had an editor who just wanted to know more character and more backstory. So expanding the canvas also.
Yeah, another kind of exciting kind of breaking a boundary by making the frame even larger in a certain way. Related, maybe a kind of barnacle question. Stephanie is wondering, where did the idea for this book come from, and how long did it take from idea to finished product?
As I said, the voice for Rose came to me maybe 6 years ago, and I very quickly wrote a short story, sort of with her voice, even though I didn't know that it was Rose. And then I began to draft in earnest in the fall of 2015. So, you know, and I turned the manuscript in for copy editing about a year ago. So a lot of time thinking, but about 4 years of active writing.
Connected, yeah, in a great way to some of what we were talking about during the discussion. Jessica wonders, do you see this as a feminist novel? Or another way of asking the question, do you see Rose as a feminist?
Yes and yes. Yeah. I don't have so much to add because I would love for people to read the book and see if they agree, but I would say yes to both those questions.
I love, parenthetically, I'm so bad at answering questions concisely, but I think there's so much authority and mystery sometimes in just saying yes. And obviously everybody should read the book and figure out for themselves what they think about its relationship to feminism and intimacy and big black brushstrokes and everything. Another question, I would be really interested in your response to this. What do you hope, congratulations, first part, and what do you hope people take away from reading your novel?
I mean, I don't know if it's for me to say exactly. I will say that I think often people are sort of horrified by Rose or talk about her as a real anti-hero, and I think that that is both true and also kind of, I wonder about it as like a defensive gesture to kind of push away what's unpleasant about her. I mean, she is unpleasant, but I also think she's connected to more of us than we maybe have an easy time admitting.
Yeah, well, and I mean, as sort of plays out in therapy and other dynamics, right? Like the things that we resist most forcefully also are illuminating in powerful ways, and they're as illuminating, if not more illuminating, than the things we gravitate towards or identify with. And I think it is really interesting to think about how characters who we sort of want to push away, how they are our teachers or our mirrors in sort of uncomfortable ways. Jake Rubin, hi Jake Rubin, says, Kyle, was there a particular book of Bernhard's that you found yourself returning to? Also, Bernhard and Dyer's drive into obsession often feels like a response to being entranced by the impossibility of perfection. Would you say that dynamic is at play in the book in relation to the demands made on a woman or in female friendship?
That's a great question. I did return to the loser a lot, but I also really read out of sheer rage Wrestling with D.H. Lawrence by Jeff Dyer a ton. And Dyer has said that when he was writing that book, he was reading The Loser by Bernhard. So maybe we're just sort of in this chain of influence. You know, I think that part of what is upsetting about Isabel to Rose is her perfection, her interest in being perfect. And I think that I actually think Rose is not interested in perfection, and a lot of her sort of anger and sort of confusion at the way people are so preoccupied with being feminine, being beautiful, being nice, being polite, is about kind of an active rejection of that. So she's not pursuing it like those two men, but the forces encouraging her to pursue it are so strong that she ends up in her own spirals.
David Buckspan wonders, as a book about both friendship and writing, specifically Rose writing a novel, I wonder what overlaps you discovered between getting to know a friend and a character, and how might that overlap with or illuminate the self-discovery made through writing a character or book or through a friend?
Yeah, I think they can be pretty similar. I think they both sometimes involve a process of clearing space or kind of leaning back. When we meet a character or a friend, we often want so much from them. I often find that the early stages of friendship are as intoxicating as a romance. I feel like we have so much to say to each other, and I'm so excited that this person can be this kind of mirror to me. And the friendship really starts when that mirror breaks or is interrupted. And I think a character also sort of starts to become real when they begin to surprise you. When Rose began to do bad things is when I like, oh, okay, I'm like really interested now. So.
Yeah, it's very interesting when Rose does bad things. I can say that from the perspective of a reader as well. Frank Farrow wonders, this is actually beautifully connected to what you were just saying. Were there surprises for you as the characters emerged and developed? Were there other surprises as you constructed the story?
I think that this maybe sort of relates back to the question about editing. This is a little bit of, I'm going to reveal my ballet nerdery at the moment, but Balanchine choreographed Apollo when he was very, very young in 1928, and he always said that Apollo was the ballet that taught him that he didn't need to put everything in, that he could save some of his ideas. And there were earlier drafts that had a whole lot of ideas about memory and the past and how people remember the past differently. And my editor so wisely pointed out that it just belonged in another book. And I think there's sort of freedom in kind of paring back a little bit. And I think maybe when you're writing your first novel, you want to put every single idea that you've ever had in it. And maybe another thing that Balanchine was trying to say is like, you'll make more ballets that can have those other ideas in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm reading right now. I'm reading this amazing book called "Suite for Barbara Loden" by Natalie Leger, and it sort of starts as an encyclopedia entry about this movie Wanda that Barbara Loden directed and starred in. But she says that it's like the single hardest thing to write is the shortest thing. That process of sort of exclusion and figuring out what matters and letting the thing rest on those whittled pieces is often the most structurally difficult. And as a long drafter. You have been subjected to some of those long drafts, and a long-winded person I identify deeply. So it's interesting to hear about that sort of pairing process. Rachel Lyon says, "Hi, Kyle, I love this novel so much. What was the experience like for you of writing a writer, particularly a writer in process, while you yourself were deep in the writing process?"
You know, I felt horribly self-conscious about it because it feels like the most sort of obvious postmodern move. Like, it's just so, what could be more tired? But because of what I was saying earlier about the ways in which writing is kind of a good way to think through the questions of empathy and intimacy, I stuck with it. And then 2 years ago, I read Don Quixote and discovered that one of the oldest novels is also a novel about writing and writers and what it means to be made into a fictional character. And that was so liberating. I was like, oh, this was not invented in the 20th century. People have been doing this from the novel's very beginning. And that kind of freed me up to be like, okay, yep, I'm gonna write about a writer, as horrible as it is.
It's totally fascinating, right? The ways that like certain things that might cause us shame, as long as they have like a deep lineage, like as long as people have been doing them for centuries, it sort of like authenticates or permits them, right? Like,
but I think it was also kind of a deeper realization that there's something about fictional text that raises the question of fictional text. And there's something about putting a character on the page that asks the question, where does this character come from? And what does it mean as a reader to encounter this fictional character? And that's not fancy gamemanship that's sort of added on. That's like intrinsic to this whole practice of storytelling.
And this, I won't completely hijack because we do have a couple more questions from other people, but that is really connected to one of the questions I didn't get to, but that had to do with the novel within the novel, and whether that was always part of your conception of this book, or whether there was a particular moment in your conception of the book where that idea of Rose's process of writing a novel sort of entered or revealed itself in some way as a strand.
I think it was always there from the beginning, and I have to say that almost every time I write a novel, it has someone trying to figure out how to be an artist. So in the way that writers tend to have just one story that they return to again and again, I guess, at least for right now, that's the story that I keep going back to.
Debbie Fleischer wonders, do you identify with Rose or Lacie more?
Who identifies with Lacie? Lacie's just sort of, perfect and doesn't want too much.
And she's a really good cook, and all the men want her.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like it's slightly terrifying to tell however many hundred people are watching that I identify with Rose, but also I wrote the book, so I guess the jig is up.
And I mean, in that way that you were speaking to, well, on a number of levels earlier, how things can be two things at once, or two ways at once, how we can be sort of gravitationally drawn toward the same people or characters who we're repelled by. I mean, like that process of identification is sort of not a monolith, but something that holds a lot of different threads inside of it too. Apologies if I say this name wrong, but Breen Ruffin says, congrats, Kyle. I love the ways in which the book seems to explore the complicated nature of relationships between women, which are often cast in a negative light and quite reductive, in a way that is thoughtful and without judgment. Is there a benefit to seeing women in this way, both in literature and perhaps in real life?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, it turns out women are people. Um, and they behave in ways that reveal things about human nature, and it's sort of tempting to otherize a woman's behavior into sort of revealing something about gender, but all of us are also people just doing people things, which are good, bad, and in between, and all over the place. So I'm so happy to hear you have that response to the book, because it's something I've definitely thought a lot about.
It's a beautiful question to end on, I think, as we kind of come to the close of this hour. It's such a pleasure. It's so funny because after having spent years talking to you about this book through various iterations, I actually feel nothing more strongly than that I would love to keep talking to you about it for hours more. And I think that speaks to something, and certainly about your mind and your presence, but about the book itself and how much it yields, and its wisdom and its acuity and its unnervingness and its rage and its beauty and its multipleness and its acknowledgement of that multipleness. It's extraordinary. And I know that some people who are here have already read it and already know that. For anybody who hasn't already read it and doesn't already know that, I would encourage you to buy the book. And I just want to say, again, congratulations. And yeah, it's just wonderful to hear you talk about it.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. And yeah, it's such a pleasure and a joy. And as I said, thank you to everyone who is listening also.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kyle and Leslie, for tonight's incredible conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight for it and engaged with your own thoughts and questions. A reminder that you can buy Kyle's book through Greenlight Bookstore, greenlightbookstore.com. You can order for direct-to-home shipping, or if you're local, you can order for curbside pickup. And if you order online within the next week, you can get 15% off with code EVERYONE. And also a reminder, if you had to miss any part of it, or you have friends or family who couldn't make it tonight, that tonight's event has been recorded. So keep an eye out on our website and our YouTube channel for that full event recording. Thanks again so much, everyone, for spending your evening with us, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Bye.
Chelsea.